Welcome to this conversation on Intrinsically Ordered about spiritual warfare. Colin and I are going to be diving down the rabbit hole. We've talked about doing a video on this, and then I called him this morning and said, do you want to record a podcast? And Colin said, when? And I said, how about 5 minutes from now? And Colin, for the outside listener, could you explain what the hell is spiritual warfare and why Catholics love talking about it?
So I feel like most people would say, like, let's start with the Bible because that's where everything starts. But Catholics don't read the Bible, so we're not going to start with the Bible. I don't know. It becomes, it's a very important part of Catholic sort of not daily life, but like regular engagement with spiritual realities is the idea that there are demons everywhere and they're always constantly manipulating your thoughts and your environment and your perception and your logical processes and every aspect of your sort of internal mental space. So anything that seems to go a counter to what the church is teaching you, it's probably a demon. It's probably demonic spiritual influence that is actively trying to pull you away from God. You know, the idea is that inside you there are two wolves. You know, one wolf is Satan and the other wolf is the Holy Spirit, I guess.
I mean, that's where Catholics, I think most people that might have just gone to like a Catholic school growing up or their family attends Christmas and Easter, there's like, yeah, there's the devil, yeah, there's God. But then like the spiritual warfare realm is where people port that into like, they're thinking about it daily, and not just daily, but like every interaction of every day is about what are the binding spirits here? Is this going to open me up to the devil? Which spirit of blank is doing this thing? Like there's the devil exists, and then there's like, and the devil is moving my coffee cup in the morning to make me angry, to get me to lash out.
Yep.
And Catholics, it's an interesting like red pill that people take when they're getting into religion. There's like they get into a religion, and then I don't know if you get the same impression, but once they hit spiritual warfare, it's like their lives go from like theology to like obsessive compulsive ideas about everything. I don't know. Do you see it as like a step in religious indoctrination?
Oh, 100%. And you can see this both in Catholicism, where I'm familiar with that, but even in like evangelical spaces and other sort of mainline American Protestant spaces, once you accept the fact that there is an ongoing, invisible, and sort of by its own nature undetectable or unfalsifiable battle between good and evil that is occupying every aspect of your life, it sort of encourages a sort of schizophrenia, and it sort of drives a lot of people to that. Like you can look at like the QAnon stuff. A lot of people got really into it because of that aspect of it. The idea of like a good versus evil cosmic battle but being not angry in the morning can contribute to, military victories,
I mean, there's something elusive about this meta narrative that like you're one of the only people that are in on it, whether it's in like politics or conspiracy theories or religion. And there's this like badge of honor that once you get on the spiritual warfare rabbit hole, you feel like you said, you being angry in the morning, or if you put a rock in your shoe throughout the day, or if you pray the right binding prayer because you think some witch is trying to cast a spell over you at your office cubicle. Like there's something elusive. Like you almost feel like a spy or like some CIA agent where you're like, there's this war between good and evil, and every action of every single day is related to this thing. And it's compelling because you're in on the secret, and people love being in on secrets.
It's main character syndrome. It really is. It puts you in the center of a narrative framing for everything that happens and has ever happened in human history. And it makes the most mundane actions essential and critical. So I get the appeal for it for sure, because it means that your sort of regular mundane boring life is suddenly super important and matters for the future of the world, and like you're suddenly the main character of a fantasy novel,
Well, and I think one of the things that we'll talk about is all of these like heuristics or phrases or unfalsifiable hypotheses that go into spiritual warfare. And one of them is like the devil only attacks people that he knows are powerful and close to God. And this is always kind of like in the stage of religious, you're going down the rabbit hole when everything's starting to feel alive. You believe in this, like whatever denomination you belong to is the one true one. And the other ones aren't just normal Christians. Like you have it right. And then you throw this layer on top of there, and it's like, and if you pick up on the fact that the devil's attacking you, it actually means that there's great things in store for you. So kind of like this false, the first idea is like, you get in and you start seeing the devil everywhere because one of the narratives is, well, if your heathen brother who does all these wicked, sinful, normal mortal sins, like the devil's not going to attack him because of course he's in the devil's clutches. It's only when you start trying to free yourself that you start seeing the devil fight back against you. And so right when you learn about this, you're also starting to see like, and now you're going to see it everywhere. And then you have red car syndrome. You're like, every car's red on the highway.
Well, I think it also has this sort of dual function, right? You have the one function of it as centering your own experience as sort of essentially important and meaningful, but it also serves as a sort of explanation or hand waving away of the problem of evil, and to explain why the Catholic promise of, hey, the sacraments and our way of life is the best way of life and will make your life the best, which they don't promise that you'll always have success in life, but they do promise that like regular participation in the sacraments and regular like adherence to Catholic moral teaching is objectively like the best way to live. And so when you start to inevitably realize that your life is not magically better because of doing all this, the devil becomes the best way to sort of hand wave that away, because it's like, oh well, that's just because you're so good that the devil is trying to ruin your life so you doubt God, you know.
But it's also to that point with the sacraments, as you're going down the religious rabbit hole, it's like mortal sin is real, and mortal sin isn't just like doing crazy war crimes that you see on the news. It's like now you have this whole category of thought crimes, and mortal sins, they're terrible. And then you're also realizing like, and that's because the devil in some way influences your brain, and all of a sudden you're now not just physical actions, you're also now accountable to the group because of your thought crimes. And so the devil moves from like these external things, or maybe you can hold like reservations when Father has this crazy sermon about whatever. You can be like, oh, I don't really agree. But then all of a sudden you're like, wait, and this, and essentially gives Catholic control, the Catholic Church control over your thoughts as well, because
Yep.
they want to protect you from the devil.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like even like, oh, if you're thinking about this stuff kind of thing too much, like it's opening a channel for the devil, so like we don't think about it too much. I mean, any sort of occult stuff, and by occult they might mean Harry Potter, so be aware that occult does not actually mean occult to Catholics, but like anything that they perceive as sort of religiously unorthodox or other becomes an avenue to open you up to demonic, interference. And so you become sort of essentially willing to buy whatever the church gives you, hook, line, and sinker, because to do otherwise, well, you could be opening yourself to a demon. And that's terrifying because we've all seen The Exorcist.
Well, and there's also, and we've talked about this on a previous discussion, that it gives you this narrative to not just see the outside world as less true. And a lot of Catholics will talk about, like, we have the fullness of the truth, and like the other denominations, especially in a more like evangelical way, or a more, it's just like they might have like degrees of truth. The outside world is like different degrees of good. But then once you have this opponent that is absolute evil, absolute depravity, quite literally the devil, and then everything else is about demons, like everything outside of the church now isn't just degrees of not good, it's degrees of horrible, terrible, people burn alive for billions of years. And now you have this narrative through which to isolate yourself from everything else, because your opponent isn't just not as good as you, it's the worst possible thing and controlled by the worst possible thing.
Yep, it's I mean, it's kind of been built into Christianity, I think, from the start, this sort of reinforcement mechanism of in-group versus out-group, and being sure that you don't associate with the out-group too much and you only associate with the in-group. Even in the Bible, you have there. I think Paul calls Satan. He's like, well, Jesus calls Satan the prince of this world, and Paul's like, he's the prince of the upper air, and all this stuff about the flesh, the world. All this stuff gets equated with essentially satanic influence. All other non-religious sort of ideologies or even thought processes become not just alternatives, but essentially evil and demonic enemies,
Wasn't the other narrative of why I think this takes hold in people's lives is because we're so, as humans, our brains are big about loss aversion. Like, to survive as humans in our psychology, we will work much harder to avoid a bad than to gain a good. And so there's not just this, I become religious because I'm nice. And you see people, and I think I've talked about this in video, where you start like, oh, you open the door to this idea of like the devil existing. And then you start painting yourself into a corner, because as soon as you realize that or you start or believing that hell is eternal conscious torment and actually people go there, and like a lot of people go there, and there's all these things that will give you a ticket straight to hell. All of a sudden you see Catholics, they keep going down the rabbit hole because they keep painting things in the floor that they can't do anymore. All of a sudden it's like, we can't watch crazy movies, and then it's like Father so-and-so said we can't even watch R-rated movies, and then the more insane priest is like, and you can't even watch movies that have kissing in there, and there's all these like dances or who you can associate or whatever it is out there. It's so easy once somebody believes in the devil to just say, and the devil likes that, and Father so-and-so says that that's okay, well, he must be controlled by the devil too. And you just keep checking things off the list that you can't do and you can't do, and it turns out you can't do that because we're so primed to. It takes one priest to tell us that's a mortal sin, and it would take 100 priests to say, no, that's actually perfectly fine. But then it's like, well, why would you even... And there's also this Catholic narrative of like, well, why do you actually care about the rules, such as what you can do before marriage? Because if we really love God, we wouldn't even care about the rules. We'd be so close to him that we shouldn't even really look at the rules or the degrees. We should just love God and not even worry about the rules.
Well, I will say, this is, I think, where the sort of unfalsifiability or the untestability of it all really comes in to hurt people, because a lot of Catholics, maybe who are watching this, are thinking, oh, that's just because you were in like a crazy circle, or oh, you were just really scrupulous, and that's just a sign of poorly formed spiritual experience or whatever, or you were improperly catechized. But the problem is, none of this stuff is testable, or you can't detect mortal sin versus not mortal sin. There's no metric for it. They can give you like, here's the definition of mortal sin, like grave matter, full knowledge, and full intention, I believe, are the three things. But those lines are lines where you have to make subjective determinations to see whether or not something that happened fit within that category. And there's no essentially unfalsifiable rubric. Like, it's not like you can measure it with a scale or, put it in a beaker, So all you're doing
also
is...
like, the church doesn't have a list of what is or isn't a
No.
mortal sin.
No,
There's lists of them. And I think a lot of people say, like, well, at my parish, my priest says that, like, going to a school dance is perfectly fine.
Yep.
And it's in line with church teaching. And then you go down the street to a trad parish, and they're like, going to prom, mortal sin, because Saint so-and-so said that the devil has us stir up our passions through dancing, and it's going to ruin our vocations. Yep. And he'll pull out a doctor of the church quote. And then you start realizing what I think is the craziest thing about the Catholic Church is that nobody can agree on what sends you to hell. It'd be the equivalent of like whatever state you live in, that the crimes that warrant the death penalty, you didn't know. Like, is it jaywalking? Is it bribery? Is it tax evasion? Is it actually going out and killing a lot of people? Like, it'd be crazy to live in a society in which you had no clue what warrant the death penalty. But in Catholicism, the things that people disagree on and what is or isn't a mortal sin, because the church doesn't have an official list. You might say you have an official list, but the church does not have a dogmatically defined list of mortal sins.
Well, not only that, they don't even have a dogmatically defined list of dogmas that you must believe. And yet, you are under pain of mortal sin for believing all of them. It's very confusing. So it does sort of lend itself to, well, better safe than sorry, right? I better be as restrictive as possible so as to err on the side of caution, because the penalty is clearly like the worst, like literally the worst possible imagined penalty. And so you're going to err on the side of caution. And to bring it back to the demonic, anything that is pulling you down towards the worst possible consequence is something that you should avoid. And whether or not you know, or for a fact that like movies with kissing in them are like a demonic gateway or not, like, it's better to be safe than sorry, right? Because some saint once said that like demons are everywhere and they are doing everything. And that's the thing, like, A, the church is 2,000 years old, and B, we live in a very comparatively moderate time in its existence. So there's lots of food for scrupulosity and extreme reactions to church teaching. When you just look at various people upheld as holy or saintly or wise or theologically sound, like Augustine or Aquinas or Anselm or Bonaventure, or all these people that are like revered as holy men of God, and they'll say these insane things that if you actually apply it to your life would result in people thinking you're like a schizophrenic person with severe mental health issues.
And the other crazy, I think, narrative that's so dangerous with spiritual warfare is the idea that like the greatest trick the devil ever played is convincing the world that he didn't exist, which is this unfalsifiable premise where it's like if it looks like the devil's not involved, if it looks like it's not a mortal sin, if you feel just fine about it, actually those positive pieces of data actually mean the opposite because he's really trying to deceive you. And so when you're like, "Oh, my relative goes to prom and it's okay." It's like, well, because of course the devil's going to make it seem fine and peaceful, but like in your life in particular, like the devil's really fighting. And so you have this huge narrative around, well, we can't investigate the devil. Like if the devil existed, we would expect him to not be apparent or investigable or have photos or any sort of interaction. We would expect that. And so then when the Catholic Church comes to the table with zero evidence, it actually means the opposite. Right? If you came to the table with no evidence for Bigfoot, people would be like, okay, so I'm probably just not going to believe. But in the Catholic world, it's like, actually, that's the lack of evidence means that there is evidence. And so people get these huge narratives where their priest scares them into a particular thought pattern or a particular practice. And then any sort of data that goes against that hypothesis actually means the opposite.
Yep, and it's completely unfalsifiable, so there's nothing to stop them from just essentially going down an infinite, ever-escalating rabbit hole until they like are a hermit, essentially. Which is why I think like cloistered religious orders are held as this like beautiful, wonderful epitome of virtue by a lot of Catholics, because it really is the end result of this thought process. It's like I will literally lock myself away in a room and not engage with the world, not speak, only think about religion.
But then also the more virtuous you become, then we also have the narrative of like, to whom much is given, much is expected, where actually like as you become more religious, as you become more aware of spiritual warfare, you don't get a free pass. You actually get more and more scrutiny, and you keep going like this because it's like, well, your mortal sins are worse because you knew it. And like your lack of binding prayers or the right sort of things, you are held to an even more high standard because you already know that the standard exists. And so people just go like this, and then it's just straight downhill, because the more downhill you go, the more downhill you go, and the more downhill you go, the more downhill you go, until you're out in crazy land if you really take all of this seriously.
Yeah, it's hard to know what would ever stop you from escalating. It's why like I grew up in the FSSP circles, which compared to most Catholics is very niche, very trad, very like I guess extreme is one word you could use. But yeah, talking as an adult now, talking to people who grew up SSPX or SSPV. Oh, you SSP people were just liberal modernists, like you weren't even real Catholics. So it's the rabbit hole just keeps going further and further. There's not really an end to it until you're like one of those two people that follow Pope Michael in Kansas or whatever.
Well, the only end state is once you have a cult leader, which is the supreme arbiter of what you can and can't do, somebody that is so close to God that they're beyond scrutiny, and that you have to listen. Like the only way spiritual warfare like doesn't demand more of you is until you find the person who controls the devil, who is the arbiter of what is or isn't there, whether that's your parish priest. Like in the fraternity, there's a lot of debates over like, is dancing sinful? Is that spiritual warfare?
Yep.
And it all depends just on the parish. Not on the parishioners, it depends on who the priest is. And then all the parishioners magically follow.
It leads to this like weird like priest cult that happens in a lot of especially traditional spaces, where it's like they're the lowest, most accessible touch point of the authority of the church, right? And they have a sacramental grace afforded to them through their ordination to be better. They even have two guardian angels, according to a lot of these trad people. So the idea is just, this is also overwhelming and confusing and terrifying. I'm just going to trust whatever the priest that makes most sense to me says. Doesn't matter what sort of credentials or backing they have or what. If they seem smart, if they make sense, and if they sort of feed into that idea of paranoia a little bit, then we're golden.
Yeah. People's views of spiritual warfare are always exactly whoever their their influencer is, whether that's their parish priest or Father Ripperger or the Exorcist Files or whatever it is, their entire belief system is always around one person because they all disagree with each other. And so the only way to terminate and not go further down the rabbit hole is to have a cult leader, like in the strictest definition of that cult leader. And that kind of brings us into the next part that I think we wanted to talk about, which is like the media empire surrounding spiritual warfare.
Oh yeah.
Tell me a little bit about, for Catholics who might not know what, like they might not know that spiritual warfare exists, but there's this whole world of podcasts and videos and influencers and movies. Tell me about this media apparatus.
So yeah, there's I mean, as you said, there's essentially the more trad you go, the more of the sort of market share of content is just taken up by fear mongering about demons. There's this weird morbid fascination, I think, because you create this complete other that's just pure evil, and is powerful and omnipresent and like doing everything constantly. There becomes a sort of fascination for it. It becomes like a morbid curiosity for a lot of people, I think, under the guise of, well, I have to learn about my enemies so I know how to defend myself. And so you get this entire cottage industry of especially exorcists who maybe they did exorcisms back in the day, but now they're just sort of retired, and a good way to make easy money is to go around speaking tours and writing books and being like, oh yeah, that's totally demonic, and oh, once a demon said this to me, and isn't that crazy? Then, the king of that is Father Chad Ripperger, who has entire omnibus volumes about the ways in which the demonic hierarchy works and how that affects your daily prayer life or whatever. And they all weigh in on cultural and political issues as well, because it's all sort of the same thing. Because if once you start believing that the world as an entity that's separate from your ever shrinking group of true religious is controlled by literal demonic entities, then you start to see movies, politicians, laws, social movements, everything as demonic. Everything that is not in full lockstep agreement with whoever you think is God's messenger is Satan trying to destroy the world. And there's an endless content mill that you can make out of that. I mean, even people like the Daily Wire hosts will constantly bring up the demonic nature of their political enemies because it...
Or just songs.
Or just songs, yeah. And a lot of it becomes a sort of recursive feedback loop because there's such an emphasis on othering the demonic as fully other. People who are also othered by the religious institutions, gay people, atheists,
many healthcare workers
will often be like, you know what? I'll adopt some of these demonic signifiers for an aesthetic way to convey my own status as an outsider to the traditional religious apparatus. And so you get things like pop stars wearing demon horns to perform on stage. And then that just sort of fuels this other outrage. See, we told you they were demonic. Look, when in reality, it's just a cultural response to being labeled demonic by people like Matt Walsh. So yeah, you have this it's essentially an omnipresent factor of all religious conservative media is this sort of demonic nature of the enemy and the other. But there's certainly specifically influencers that focus entirely on it, like Ripperger and plenty of others. I mean, there's that exorcist in Illinois that's currently the center of a bit of a culture war fight.
Because there's let's see, Ripperger, there is the Exorcist Files, that's Father Carlos Martins, there's Father Vince Lampert, there's the one priest, I don't know if he's an exorcist, but all he talks about is spiritual warfare, that's been on the Michael Knowles show and the Matt Walsh show. And there's a few other, there's the exorcists, and then there's kind of the regurgitators of exorcist talking points, just kind of exhorting you to general stuff. Mm-hmm. But Catholics are obsessed with these salacious stories by these exorcists of people levitating, people floating, people speaking dead languages. These, one of the big things I remember is these priests talking about they'd secretly hide the Eucharist under 3 different boxes and then move each box close, and magically the person knew they could feel the Eucharist burning them, or the rosary, or picking up and flying people around. It's it's in the way in which
there was a thing with Rod Dreher. He's obsessed with the demons. He's a Catholic conservative. Well, I think he's Orthodox now, possibly. That whole realm. He he was on some evangelical girls podcast recently. I forget who it was, but he was essentially talking about that, where like, oh, I had a good friends who were this like upper echelon New York society couple, and their wife got possessed, and he brought over a relic of the true cross, and she completely like changed into like her demon self and was like, I know you have that, get rid of it, I don't want it here, even though it was like completely out of sight and stuff.
Well, in many ways, exorcisms are the closest thing that Catholics have to proof, because there's a lot of arguments out there, but there's this like hidden world, this set of knowledge, and our Catholicism is backed up by both the negative, so like these demonic stories, and then also then you kind of have be a whole other rabbit hole, the positive, like the Eucharistic miracles and the apparitions, which is like a whole other side. But the closest thing that Catholics will get to when they really feel pressed on like maybe the apologetics aren't working is, well, Father Chad Ripperger saw a lady levitate.
Yep.
Like, how did that happen? And I find that Catholics take these stories as such absolute gospel, for lack of a better term, when and this is kind of like the unfalsifiable nature of the priest. So then also kind of like bookend the stories by saying, but if you show up to an exorcism, like you're probably not going to see it, because then it would be proof for your faith that like if you really saw it. Or, well, how come you don't record like a girl levitating? Like if you recorded that and it was proven that there's no special effects, like that would break the internet. Oh, but well, the devil wouldn't want the world to know that he exists, or you in particular. And there's even, as I've said before, like Father Vince Lampert on his podcast with Matt Fradd said that the story of the girl levitating, and then he's like, and the guy next to me remembered it completely differently and said that the girl was just laying there the whole time. Which, if you admitted that in the court of law, that your story, somebody that you know, like, and trust, and was there, and you think saw things correctly, saw the complete opposite, your story would be thrown out. But Catholics, there's this like, you can't investigate because, one, like the devil's going to be there. Two, you don't have a strong enough faith to actually see the miracles. So what a virtuous person would do is not investigate and not expect anything to actually happen, which is once again these unfalsifiable hypotheses that mean the complete opposite. The lack of evidence, the lack of investigation actually means it exists.
It's a weird sort of like extremely magical worldview that also primes you to expect no magic in your life whatsoever, which is it's very interesting. I don't know. I think it's why a lot of traditional Catholics when they leave, they end up going down like a sort of new age spiritual rabbit hole, because you're primed to have this magical expectation of the world, but then the Catholic Church is very upfront. They're like, well, yeah, we're not going to give you any evidence of that. So it makes a lot of them kind of look elsewhere for it. Ironically, since that is like pure demons to most Catholics.
Well, and so there's kind of this, like we talked about, where you have all of these crazy stories, these huge media empires built around these salacious stories that you can't investigate. And people go, and that's where people pick their pet favorite exorcist, because, well, if Father Chad Ripperger exorcised somebody for insert mortal sin, like, obviously it has to be true. In all of these exorcists, they don't agree on everything, and they call various things demonic, but they also, in a weird way, base their entire knowledge off of talking to the devil.
Yes,
like,
they do. It's very fun.
And there's these crazy, and Father Ripperger has this whole sermon on like what devils or what demons can lie about and what they can't lie about, and there's certain magical spells, once again, that you're casting over, like you have to make the devil, and so in this weird, like, in a way that would, I think, be like gravely offensive to a lot of mainstream Catholics, like Father Ripperger, and I'm just using him as an example because I know most of his content, but all these exorcists do it where their knowledge is coming from the devil, literally, because the demons said it under pain of sin or whatever. This was the demon said that this particular activity was the way into somebody's life. Like, and they're running almost pseudoscientific tests of like, what relics are people having a reaction to? It's this like scientific or pseudoscientific investigation of the devil and learning about the devil from the devil instead of from God, which I think would shock your average kind of like JP2 Catholic.
Well, it's also very interesting to me because as someone who's had like a personal sort of interest in like learning about Western esoteric practices and like occult stuff over the years, the way that Chad Ripperger talks about how he interacts with demons and learns from demons about the demonic is essentially the exact same style of ritual magic as you read in like Renaissance era books of magic. It's literally like, here's all the proper prayers that you say, and all the like, you have to go to confession and you have to be like purified and this and that, and then you can get this demon to teach you about the workings of hell, and then or science and stuff, and it's like you command them all in the name of God to do this and not lie or do that. And I'm like, it's essentially just the same as Father Ripperger. It's just that he doesn't have as many bells and whistles.
Wendy says that his version of investigating the devil is from God, so
Right.
obviously it has to be true.
Well, ironically, a lot of older occult stuff also says that. Like, it's all framed that way. So it's not like he's doing anything that different. It's very uncommon that you will find in like occult traditions written by actual occult practitioners, people being like, yeah, I'm out here making pacts with Satan. A lot of times you'll read that as like exorcist polemics will write books like that, like, oh yes, all these people are making pacts with Satan. But yeah, it's interesting how little has changed since like the 1500s in this entire realm.
And I think Catholics get, especially when they're thinking through these narratives, they always think, how do we explain the telling of this story, and not, can we actually verify the story, right? If the story is Father Chad Ripperger, he talks about he was doing this exorcism, and this lady who didn't know any Latin at all started speaking Latin, and then also started speaking this dead language from, I think it was like the Native Americans or something, and Catholics will be quick to say, and explain how that happened. And you're like,
It's
prove that the story happened.
It's very much
Right, like,
the same as like assuming that the Gospels are inerrant eyewitness accounts of history, and like with that assumption, then reconciling them by sort of inventing facts that are not evidence. Where like, oh, how do we reconcile the birth narratives? Like, well, we're going to come up with a whole convoluted schema that isn't in evidence just to make that work. It's the same with these sort of exorcist stories where they'll just assume that they're true, and then they will add facts that are not in evidence to make it work. Like, oh, well, okay, I guess we did try to film this one, but nothing was on tape, so it must be the demons corrupted the tape. Or, oh, this so-and-so didn't see it, so it must just be that their faith isn't high enough, or, things like that. Or the demon just stopped performing the minute we turned the camera on because they don't want proof to come out. Stuff like that.
well, and Catholics always love talking about this case from, I believe it was the Midwest, all about the house became infested with demons, and the kid, and as this story goes, this atheist, liberal child psychologist from the government, so we're just like poisoning the well, like the worst possible person out there.
Yep.
This little girl came into her office and started climbing the walls, and she didn't even know how to explain it. And so if these crazy liberal, probably the trope would be cat-owning, childless psychologists talk about how this child was climbing up the walls in her reports, how could it not be true? And then you actually look at the reports, and it's just not even mentioned.
No,
Like,
it's
these
true.
stories are made up whole cloth, which is why I never feel the need when somebody's like, explain how this happened. And then you're like, explain where the proof is, or even an accurate account of what happened from actual reliable people. Because conveniently, the cameras never work. The audio is just, it could easily be feigned, like the Annalise exorcisms. It's just, she could have made that voice without the devil.
Yeah.
And is just talking about these layers to hell. The people are always people that are already primed to believe the things. It's always priests, it's always lay people, and then you never actually talk to the person who's affected. And then Catholics will say, but, and this is something that I see a lot on YouTube comments, is like, well, when somebody comes to be exorcised, they have to do a psychological evaluation before they even can talk to the exorcist. So it clearly isn't mental illness. And then you look at all these cases, and it either A, never happens, B, happens by a Catholic psychologist, or C, is like a half-hour meeting with a psychologist that's like, yeah, I don't see anything. And then they're clearly manifesting symptoms of not the devil, but the diagnostic criteria for a lot of mental illness. But then you can't treat mental. Yeah.
I could talk about like even like local stories that I know from like so my I have a friend who his parents are Latin American Catholics, and they had, his mom was telling me the story. She's like, yeah, I was in church, and this person came in, and midway through mass they just started like spouting off like demonic, like essentially, like, it's not like they were having a seizure. And then the priest went over and like exorcised them, and she's like, oh, it was so great to watch like God's in action. I'm like, you're just describing someone being denied medical treatment for a schizophrenic or like a epileptic fit. And I think a lot of stories are just that, because there was no psych eval, there was no exorcist there. It was just a priest in the parish and some people being like, oh, clearly that's a demon. And the same Same woman, her her son was like, as a kid, was like, I guess, a problem child, right? Like misbehaving. So she brought him to like some, not Bible study, but like some, like group of like holy women. And they like did an exorcism of the demon of like rebelliousness. And they were like all in a circle, like holding hands with him in the middle, like chanting to get rid of the demon. And like a lot of Catholics will be like, "Oh, that's not sanctioned." Like that, they were doing their own thing, and it's like, well, okay, but again, a lot of this is parish by parish, community by community, what people are convinced of as being what the church teaches, because the church doesn't do the work to lay out, here's what we teach.
And conveniently, the dioceses that have entire exorcist ministries and talk about it a lot find the most number of demons. Like, the rate of looking for demons and the rate of finding demons are just the same line on the graph. And a Catholic might respond, well, it's because, like, the other dioceses, they're not trying to fight the devil, and so the devil's not going to manifest himself. And that's where you're like, this is why it's such a terrible narrative, because if we were to look at the evidence is looking for demons and finding demons magically line up, and the theology of the particular demons always matches the manifestation of particular demons, and they all contradict. And if you're using your brain that isn't scared to death by the thought of eternal conscious torment and the thought of all these demons, and that you too might get possessed, if you just looked at the data, you're not getting to the demonic. But when you have when people are, or when you have the idea of hell's there and the devil's real and the devil's trying to trick you about the fact that the devil doesn't actually exist, and you have all of these narratives that we talked about going in your head, then these ideas latch on. You latch on preemptively to these stories with very little evidence, and that's why, like, you can't critically evaluate these stories, because if you actually looked at when was this reported, what were the actual reportings, and not what does Father so-and-so say about this story that he heard from Sister so-and-so, who was talking about their uncle, who talked about then the parish priest who did this exorcism, and now you're back like decades ago from 8 people down the line. It's like, that's not good evidence unless you have these narratives baked on top of it.
Yep. I mean, I think it's honestly a good, really microcosm of how legends spread and stories grow in the retelling. And I think, personally, I think it should give more Christians pause about the reliability of some of the New Testament scriptures, because it's in an age where the internet exists. We have access to all the information to disprove these stories. People still believe them wholeheartedly and spread them and share them. Like my brother went to Catholic University of America, and there was a story on campus that, the boys who was possessed, that was the inspiration for the Exorcist movie, he was kept in this room on campus. Not true. He was never involved with Catholic University of America. There was some other university in DC that he was at briefly. Fully believing Catholics in this university, it just became part of the true narrative of the possession. Like, oh yeah, here's this room, that's where he was, and that's, you can go and look at it, and isn't that proof? Like, isn't that crazy? It's like,
Is that the narrative where the priest then, like, slept in that room overnight, and halfway through the night the priest's mattress starts levitating in this room? Because I heard about that too, and all of these stories, you can see them in real time getting absurd over the course of a week on Twitter, let alone you think about, like, the gospel narratives. Dozens, even the faithful Catholics can admit that the gospels were written multiple decades after these miraculous events. Like, even the Scott Hahns of the world are gonna, like, they can say, well, like, they knew the eyewitnesses, but you see how out of hand these demonic stories get in a few weeks, or even you say that over the course of a year, through the roof. The next thing you know, you're writing about 5,000 pigs drowning themselves after an exorcism, or these Catholic stories of infestations. And kind of like, maybe the next topic is, these exorcists all have these elaborate worlds of, like, this mythology or this pantheon of the various devils of various things, that in, like, vanilla Catholic circles, there's just the devil and demons. But then as you get, like, down the iceberg, if we're going for, like, some Gen Z slang here, the, like, spiritual warfare iceberg, you get down to these, Father Chad Ripperger has the demon of lesbianism, demon of butch lesbianism.
I was going to say, there's two lesbian demons. There's the femme and the butch lesbian.
Yeah, the femme and the butch, and then the gays have their own demons, and the various points in transition. Like, there isn't just demons out there. There's very specific ones that do very specific things, that control very specific people in the media. And then you realize like how come we can't have an educated conversation about queer rights? And then you realize like half the people at the table are trying to figure out, are you controlled by the demon of femme lesbianism or butch lesbianism?
Yep.
And like which 10-year-old child was abducted in the 70s to be used in a occult ritual where they disembowel a child,
Right.
and that's the start of the gay rights movement. It wasn't like Stonewall or anything. It was like which elite New York City pizza bakery has been trafficking children that started the gay rights movement.
Yep.
And you realize that, like, we can't have good discussions about any of these topics when you've poisoned the well and somebody shows up and Father so-and-so is giving them their guide to like what demons control you specifically or the movement that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean it's why we use the word demonizing. Like they literally demonize the ideological and political opponent by making it so that everything, whether or not they know it, they're being ruled by the devil because they don't have they don't have God in their heart, so they're not protected, and so they would never know because the devil doesn't like to show himself. So even if they don't realize it, and even if they deny it, they're being ruled by the devil or one of his many servants that we all have names for, a categorization list for.
Well, there's a friend that we both have who leaked us a set of documents from a diocese's like basically manual of exorcisms, and there's this whole list of the various holidays, the various rituals, the various degrees of these groups, and it's very specific, almost recipes that involve abducting children from various things for the various holidays. And they're like, where did you get this from? And the answer is like
Nowhere books, random stories. Someone who's like, oh yeah, I was in satanic abuse as a kid, and this was what they did, and so they just like, all right, we'll add this to the list.
Just kind of like a rolling list.
For anyone who's not familiar, people in the Satanic Panic in the 80s, there was a lot of emphasis on repressed memory as this way of recovering traumas that people had forgotten, and it ended up being debunked later as memory was shown to be extremely easy to edit or influence after the fact through leading questions and things like that. So essentially a lot of children got traumatized into thinking that they had been abused by Satanists, by a bunch of like overeager psychologists. And so you have this whole cottage industry of a lot of like Gen X and millennials writing these books being like, oh, I was in a satanic cult that had like 15,000 people gather for like a human sacrifice ceremony once a month. And it's like, there's no evidence for it. It's sort of like practically impossible half the time. Like they've been investigated. These things have been thoroughly checked and are just not true. And yet they continue to spread, especially in trad circles. Like it's not unusual to find like speakers touring that are like, yes, I'm a reformed Satanist. I used to like drink the blood of virgins every other month, and now I'm just on a speaking tour. It's like, why are you not in prison if that's true?
There's one guy in particular that I forgot his name of Zachary King, who not the TikToker who makes like trendy edits, Zach King, but this was a ex-Satanist who tells a story. Essentially, he was a high Satanist priest, and he personally froze Bill Gates for like 2 days or something. They were at their, because of course Bill and Melinda Gates go to their Satanist convention and wherever, obviously because they have birth control. And they were doing a cult, and he froze Bill Gates, and then somebody begged him to, please, Bill Gates will do whatever you want, like just unfreeze him. And then eventually found the Eucharist and spent like 16 hours a day in the Adoration Chapel, and now he's reformed. And like there's voices criticizing some of these more ludicrous stories until you realize that, I mean, when you have Bill Gates is like, that's a level 2 storytelling. But then Father Ripper talking about how Ariana Grande in particular is possessed by the spirit of whatever.
Yep.
It's in all these things like we talked about are based on urban legends being told 8 different times, and their lists or their evidence is just like, I heard that this celebrity was possessed by whatever. And you're like, add it to the list. And then these lists of holidays and events and rituals are just kind of rolling lists of urban legends. But when the consequences are so high to disbelieving, you kind of just like, oh, well, if it's kind of true, like we might as well just assume that it's true.
Yep.
And then we can't question it because, well, Ariana Grande's demon might actually be controlling you too if like you don't open yourself up. And that's why all this is a giant control apparatus, because it goes in one direction and you can't go back out because of human psychology. and you keep going further and further in, and the priest that you listen to has more and more control over what you can do, what you can't do, who you can associate with, what sort of things you do, how much you have to be donating, what sort of rituals you have to be doing all day long, these various like binding prayers.
How you dress, what you eat. Like they will literally tell you, like, okay, if you're eating too unhealthy, that's a sin. If you're not doing enough exercise, maybe that's a sin. Like depending on the priest or their priorities, like they can essentially have control over whatever aspect of their life they want.
And you can't ever escape those ideas because the devil lives in your mind. And it depends on which theologian you talk to about, like, can the devil know your thoughts and all these things? But the lived reality is that the local priest, whoever you listen to, like, you can't disobey them or even think to disobey them because the devil's going to be in your brain. And not only are the generic sacraments are just not, the generic sacraments aren't good enough for you. Even though they say like confession's even more powerful than an exorcism, but there's also this weird theology of like, well, it's not necessarily one exorcism. You can have a lot of exorcisms. And it turns out that the sacraments don't protect you, the right prayers don't protect you. Only the specific cult leader that you have around spiritual warfare has the right formula, and only they can really protect you. Because even the Novus Ordo exorcists, like the new rite of blessing holy water, is just not strong enough.
Not strong enough.
So like, yeah, so you need Father Ripperger or your local FSSP priest or SSPX, them to bless the holy water, not Father so-and-so down the road. And then you're like, so this is taking over your life.
Yep.
But if it's true, Colin, right? If it's true, it doesn't matter what we say. If it's true, the devil's, like, it's just true.
And I know a lot of Catholics who are listening will be like, oh, well, clearly these people are like not understanding Catholic teaching. Like, oh, well, Catholicism is supposed to, it's in the name, it's a universal church. Like, you're not supposed to have to go to one priest or another priest. It's the whole church is good. And the sacraments themselves are enough to keep you safe and in communion with Christ. And even the name of Jesus is like enough to protect you or whatever, all this stuff. Like, yes, that is one way to approach Catholicism. That's one way to engage with it. But the problem is that the desire to avoid hell and the scriptural and historical emphasis in the church on the reality of the demonic work together to essentially propel you down an ever escalating rabbit hole of crazy.
Then you have, you get into this weird, when Catholics do apologetics surrounding like the selling of indulgences, you start seeing in the deeper end of spiritual warfare, when 3 Days of Darkness came around, you need your beeswax candles, and conveniently the person that told you that also sells them. You can't have like generic ones from Target or whatever because they have like trans kids swimsuits or whatever. Like, you need to only buy from the person, or you need the right type of metal or the right color of scapular or the right book or the right amount of salt or the right medallions to put in your house. And you see people, like I have a friend and his uncle is a bishop, and he said that after 3 Days of Darkness, even he had to put like the brakes on some of these old ladies spending thousands and thousands of dollars on beeswax candles because of 3 Days of Darkness, which has been talked about kind of in church history for forever. And then like the internet all of a sudden popularized it. And then as soon as it's popularized, it's also like authoritative. Those, once again, are graphs of like being popular and authoritative. Also the exact same line. And then you have these people, and that's another downside to spiritual warfare. Not only is it controlling you, but it's also draining people of their time, their resources, and their money, because going to heaven is worth any cost. And even if Father so-and-so says that I need to make a certain donation for mass intentions, you have this weird simony, but it's not technically simony because that's outlawed by the church, but it's de facto simony around, or simony, over what you have to buy and what you have to do and who you have to listen to. And even like the Exorcist files, I just pulled up the main homepage. You can enter the vault, their premium set of teachings and stuff for $7 a month. Like, yeah, of fighting the devil is as easy as giving somebody your money, it turns out. There's deliverance, and the money that you spend. Also, it's one of those graphs that looks exactly like this, of deliverance from a demon and the amount of money or resources that you give to whatever priest that you're talking to.
And I know this might seem like this is the way we're talking about it is very Catholic specific, but I mean, for what it's worth, I don't think that like conservative evangelical streams are safe from that, because they have their own sort of, it's just different vibes of artifact. Like, yeah, they might do the oil or the water or a prayer card or something like that, whereas Catholics, it's more likely to be like scapulars and medals and the beeswax candle thing. But it's essentially just it's a tactic. It's very good for control. It's very good for money, and it's popular. So it's an easy sort of gravy train to keep going down for people like Ripperger.
And then it's also allows people to have, like, if we think about the fallacy of poisoning the well, spiritual warfare is the ultimate poisoning of the well before you engage in a conversation with somebody. And halfway through, you realize they will never change their mind because they believe whatever political topic you're talking about, whether that's taxing the rich and providing for the poor, well, that's actually the demon of whatever. And then all of a sudden you realize, like, you're not actually debating somebody to have an actual conversation. You realize they have this impenetrable wall around their beliefs, which is the fear that their local spiritual leader has instilled in them. And then everything else is just mute, it's just arguing for the sake of arguing and throwing ideas out there for the sake of throwing ideas out there. So it's controlling your life, it's controlling the government. And it's wild to think. I mean, even when we talk about the political domain, the idea of Speaker Mike Johnson with this idea of a trans woman now being in Congress, that, well, it's because Scripture tells me that men are men and women are women and those can't change. And so then you're like, wait, so we're not even, we can't have a good faith conversation about anything political when it's, well, really my beliefs are rooted in something that you can't criticize. Because if, especially in America, you can't criticize somebody's religion, even if it's the basis for oppression, for harming other people, because religious ideas are the sacrosanct, untouchable thing that you can't have conversations about. But on the other side, they can be the source of beliefs for somebody else.
Oh, I mean, fully. During segregation and slavery, like, it was religion that was used as a sort of, well, you can't infringe on my sincerely held religious belief that all descendants of Ham are cursed to be slaves, and that's why I can own people. It's the same rationale that's existed, especially in this country, for a long time. It's just whenever they feel politically powerful enough to weaponize it, they do, and it's what we're seeing now. And the whole demonic helps with that. Like, I think I forget exactly, but I remember reading that you can sort of look at periods of political, economic, social turmoil and any associated, like, belief or increased belief in, like, the demonic and the sort of mystical side of religion becoming more important again. And I think we're definitely living in one of those upswings for sure.
And I mean, it's Catholics always love talking about Harry Potter, and I feel like the Harry Potter debate's a whole microcosm of the absurdity of this, which is it's a book that children have read, and from a secular perspective, like, you might like the narratives, you might like the writing, you might not, and you're like, awesome. And if you're talking to somebody, you can kind of have like, oh, let's talk about books, and then you're like, I might read it to my kid, I might not, like, whatever it is, and then you move on with your life.
At worst, you can be like, oh, well, maybe I don't like what it's like, its moral lessons. Like, maybe I think that the moral lessons it's trying to teach are bad. Like, okay, like, I maybe I disagree or whatever, but, like, I understand, like, those kind of criticisms.
And then you come to the table with, all of a sudden you hear Father Chad Ripperger talks about there was this lady and she was reading Harry Potter and was reading the spells and accidentally burned her house down. Like, now we're admitting that into the conversation. People are getting that actually that J.K. Rowling actually talked to witches to actually get these spells come from the secret knowledge, because she was actually with witches, and people are burning their houses down, and he's exorcised people that said the gateway to the devil possessing them was from Harry Potter. And they start realizing it's this microcosm of, let's have debates about things we can investigate, things that we can disagree on, things that we can just talk about and be on an equal playing field. And then as soon as you admit the fact that, oh, your kid might be reading Harry Potter and burn your house down, it's like, what incarnation? Like, now we're having the worst possible conversation. And maybe moving kind of into our last point here, which is on Catholics are obsessed with Satanism. And it's so hard to talk to Catholics about Satanists don't actually worship the devil.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the whole point is that they are making fun of the fact that you are scared of them. They are becoming boogeyman because it's funny, because it offends you so bad, and you clutch your pearls so hard when somebody has red lighting on during the DNC speech. So you're like, this is literally demonic. Or singers will do it, like Lil Nas X recently got possessed, it turns out, because he alluded to ideas of Satanism. You know, like, you realize people are doing this to press your buttons explicitly. It's for that reason. There's kind of the spiritual realm to kind of the New Age movement, and there are people who actually believe in witchcraft. But by and large, all of the public displays of Satanism are there because they think it's funny, because you are using Satanism to oppress them, and so they're embracing it and making you clutch your pearls and slow down and all these things. It's a funny thing when you take off the spiritual lens.
I mean, it's a time-honored tradition, honestly. I mean, you can look back to 1700s and stuff like that. You start to see a lot of like romantic Satanist ideas where increasingly more Enlightenment thinkers and atheist types started looking at Christianity and being like, well, I don't agree with a lot of the moral prescriptions of Christianity, or I find X, Y, or Z harmful about Christianity. And so they start to look at Satan as the character who's the antagonist to the Christian God. And they're like, well, maybe he is kind of standing for something similar to I'm standing for if I'm also against sort of these weird moral prohibitions that God seems to place on things that shouldn't be a problem. And so it becomes a sort of symbol in a literary sense of a character who they might find to be relatable. I mean, it starts with like Paradise Lost, where you have Satan as a sort of character instead of a faceless entity in one of the most first prominent times that he's portrayed that way. And so you have a lot of figures, like William Blake famously said that John Milton was of the devil's party and didn't even know it. Because they find a lot to like in the character of Satan, and they find a lot to dislike in the character of God, and that informs their political and religious convictions. And so you have this sort of modern descendant of that in like people like Sam Smith and Lil Nas X putting on devil outfits and performing. I mean, they're not reading John Milton, I'm guessing, but they know what it means to be othered by religious people for innate characteristics like being gay and disagreeing with religious moral paradigms around sexuality and being labeled as demonic, because that's something that's still being done by Christians, as we've been talking about. So for them to be like, hey, you know what, if you're going to call me a demon and say I'm going to hell, then like, all right, maybe I am, maybe I will. What are you going to do about it? You know, it's a sort of a standing up for it. And then you have, of course, actual Satanists like the Church of Satan or the Satanic Temple. And for them, it is like a sort of committed, like, yes, I actively disagree with like famously the Satanic Temple, not sorry to say, the Church of Satan. Their founder wrote the whole Satanic Bible, and reading that, I mean, it's essentially just, hey, I think the 10 Commandments are dumb. Here are like 11 better ones that I think work better for human flourishing, and also just sort of an edgelord desire to trigger people. But it starts from a sincere sort of rejection of Christian moral paradigms and an embrace of Satan as a symbol of that rejection. You know, it's not about like, oh yeah, I actually think that he exists and I'm doing magic because I think his magical powers are strong or whatever. You do find people like that, but they're like a vast minority, and they're not usually going to call themselves Satanists.
Yeah, and I think that'll kind of wrap up our discussion here, which is the whole rabbit hole of spiritual warfare. There's infinite rabbit holes to go down, infinite like microcosms to talk about, infinite implications. But I feel like in this hour and 4 minutes, we've gone through the bulk of kind of bringing people through the world, which is spiritual warfare, some of our critiques of it, and yeah, anything else that we want to add?
I mean, I could talk about this forever, so probably, but I think it's a good place to end, like you said.
Yeah. Well, we'll have future videos out there about this. But thank you, Colin, for joining me. And
Absolutely.
yeah, hopefully you guys have an awesome demon-free rest of the day.